Hey guys, I'm Jenna Busch, and welcome to the Science of Star Wars virtual panel. I am the founder of Legion of Leia, used to co-host a show with Stan Lee. I've contributed to 11 of the books in the Psych Geek series, including Star Wars Psychology. But before we start, I'll tell you a little bit about our topic. We've been doing this for over 6 years now, I think 6.5 years. So it's just the science of everything in the Star Wars universe. We have asked for questions online, so whatever we've got, we're going to ask. And we'll try to come up with some new topics because the last time we did this panel, since then, we have the Mandalorian, Rise of Skywalker. So we'll see if we can get some of those questions in. So I'm going to start with Fon. I'll have you introduce yourself. Tell us what you do.
Hi, my name is Fon Davis. I am a visual effects artist. I run a company here in LA. Worked on over 40 feature films, including the Star Wars movies. So I worked on the Star Wars special editions and the prequels. Yeah, I'm just really happy to be here today.
With your buddies.
With all my friends. There's a couple of us cheating and working together at my studio, but it's just us. Droids and aliens only.
Yoda can use the Force.
Yeah,
Travis? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, he's fine. I think he's immune.
Well, my buddy is on the dark side. I've got Darth with me. I am Dr. Travis Langley, professor of psychology. Talking over Fon's face. It is not switch. Is it showing me on anybody else's? Is it showing Fon on mine?
It's showing you on ours.
All right. WonderCon people, edit that out. All right. Okay, it's not going to show me as the speaker on my own, but that's the recording. Maybe I should just toast. I don't know. Whatever. All right, so I'm going to be talking in a little corner. I don't know how this is going to work. Just don't ask me a lot. I am here up in the corner, Dr. Travis Langley, professor of psychology at Superheroologist on Twitter. Author of Batman and Psychology, and editor and lead writer on a number of other books, such as Star Wars Psychology, The Dark Side of the Mind.
And Kieran?
Hi, I'm Kieran Dickson. I'm a pop culture journalist of 7.5 years now, and I'm currently working at Columbia University as a content strategist. And I've been doing these panels from day one for 6 years.
And Steve?
Hi everyone, I'm Steve Huff. I'm a edged weapons and combatives expert, fight choreographer, and martial arts instructor. And I've also been with the panel, I think, since we started doing this. It's been a while.
Yeah, long time. Just so you all know, I will be looking down sometimes because my notes are here. You can't see them, but I have them. So let's start off. We usually start off these panels with some kind of crazy question like, are droids slaves, or Kylo Ren's lightsaber? So this time, let's talk about something lovely. Let's talk about Baby Yoda, because I love Baby Yoda. Baby Yoda was clearly engineered for people to fall in love with. So are there specific things that you can point out about Baby Yoda that were clearly part of the design to make us fall in love?
Absolutely. Like the big eyes, for sure. And he has that little bit of an overbite with his lip. That's very baby-like. and I just think overall proportions, it's just very much like all those things that babies and kittens and everything adorable has, so we don't eat them.
I don't want to eat Baby Yoda.
Well, that's it. That's exactly it. Isn't that the theory that in nature things are cuter when they're babies because you don't want you want a certain amount of sympathy towards those babies because they're vulnerable. I don't know.
The alternate view is that we are evolved to find babies cute, so that we don't eat them. Those who did not find them as cute and ate them, they did not survive to reproduce. Therefore, it's not that. It's not. Maybe it's just the. I'm totally mangling this word, but the reverse of what Fon said, an evolutionary theory. Kieran, you had something you were saying?
Well, that would make sense because I've never seen a baby porg, and there's tons of those around. So something must happen to stop us from eating baby porgs. I mean, they're cute, right?
Vegetarian, I will not eat bird. Also, I like them.
I have to say, I'm almost embarrassed and ashamed to say this, but I was not a big fan of Baby Yoda at first. That actually made me stop watching it. And then I gave it another chance, and my opinion did change. But it was because of the big, cute eyes and everything that Fon mentioned. I was like, oh, I wanted to see something get shot.
Did you want to eat him?
But my opinion did change. I would have eaten Baby Yoda. Yes, I'm sorry to say. But my opinion did change after watching the show, and he did kind of grow on me. So maybe that had something to do with it. I just was not.
I think my son Alex was similar in that he had commented. Alex, who also is in psychology, he was against watching The Mandalorian because of Baby Yoda. Simply because he saw Baby Yoda, he knew this thing is going to be in my face everywhere.
Oh, yes. With the chalky milk and the chicky nuggy memes. They're the cutest. But staying on The Mandalorian, I'm actually really curious because I've always wondered, playing video games for so many years, a lot of characters fight with masks on. We've certainly seen that in Star Wars. But now, as a runner who tries to do a half marathon with a mask on, I can tell you it is not an easy thing to do. So I'm curious from a fighting perspective, how do you do that?
I tell you, it is so difficult, especially when you're doing something that is either fantasy or sci-fi based, because there you're going with a look that is more for the aesthetic, whereas like historical armor and like even modern tactical gear, it's all designed for a purpose. So it's not that hard when you're wearing it, because everything that's actually made for a reason, it's made to be able to do what it needs to do. But a lot of like costume pieces and fantasy and sci-fi masks, they get those cool narrow visors and all of that, and that cuts down your vision. So whenever I've had to do any kind of fight and anything like that, you really have to learn how to just kind of trust the way you move, right? If that makes sense, you kind of fight by feel. Even with a lot of the sparring gear, you'll see that it generally gives you a lot of really good, visual ability. But then when you look at a Mandalorian helmet, they have these tight visors. So it'd be extremely difficult to be able to fight in something like that if you did not spend the majority of your life in it. And we kind of see that in that code where he never takes off his helmet. It's like anything the human body is able to adapt. So if you were in a helmet like that, all that start to be able to make up for those shortcomings. But yeah, learning how to fight in something like that would be very hard.
Yeah, when you go to the designs of those costumes too, the fact that it's in Star Wars kind of relieves some of the difficulties of wearing a mask all the time, because if you look at some of the behind the scenes books where they break down how the technology works, you'll see there's a lot of technology in the helmets. So presumably you would get fresh air and you would get protection from gases and smokes and things like that. So it would be a protective helmet with technology. A lot of them even have heads-up displays. I don't know if you guys remember in Revenge of the Sith, when Darth Vader was getting his helmet put on, like all these heads-up displays came on. So those would probably be aids in helping someone in combat as well. So they're not just masks. Like when we put on a Stormtrooper mask from Hasbro, it's not going to be the same as a Star Wars mask in the show. The technology is there.
Oh, bummer.
I know. By the way, I'm not running in a Stormtrooper mask, just so everyone knows. It's just one of those. But yeah, speaking of never removing your helmet, so I'd love to hear about the psychology of that. Is is it removing the personality to be a part of a greater whole, or what would you say in terms of that? Because it's frustrating because he's a very pretty man and I'd like to see his face. Just saying.
There actually is quite a bit of research on the effects of wearing masks. The depersonalizing qualities for the most part, but it depends on the nature of the mask, the design of what's going on there. So if you've got everybody looking the same, like most stormtroopers, they become very depersonalized, very low in their sense of individuality, less conscious of who they are as people, and that very strongly tends to make people more susceptible to following orders, to violating their own personal norms and following the norm of the situation in which they're in. And logically, this is something that the Empire would want in their stormtroopers. They would want them to be low in inclination to do their own thing. Whereas if you're someone who wears a mask but want a strong sense of self, you will personalize it. You will change it. You will have it where even though there's a basic look, you're still not going to look exactly like the next bounty hunter. You've got your own distinct style. And you look at superheroes, they wear different costumes, even though it still brings out something different from their everyday lives. So there is an identity. It can still be different from how you act without the costume, without the mask, with your face out there where the whole world can see you. And there is still something that can help you change your own behavior to a preferred way of doing things, even with the individual aspect to it.
And that's similar to, if you think about, you know, you've got your clone troopers and your stormtroopers. You would think that the clone troopers would be given less of a sense of identity, but because they were, you know, working for the Republic, who were much more kind of open and weren't looking to constrain them, they were allowed to kind of decorate their masks. They were allowed to kind of like show their personality. You don't see any of that with the stormtroopers, who are actually individual people and have different personalities. So it's all about how the man is kind of putting that kind of force on top of you.
Do you guys think that the masks also instill a certain sense of confidence for those people wearing it because of the intimidation factor?
Well, that's what Stormtrooper armor was for, right? It wasn't actually to stop any blaster weapons from hurting them. It was purely for intimidation.
Yeah, the Ewoks also proved.
Yeah, and I mean, there is a long-standing tradition of, you know, where you see particularly helmets, but even getting into military hats like the big giant shakos, those were meant to make the soldiers more menacing, more imposing, you know, the large crests. You know, there were the Polish hussars that had the winged pieces on their backs. They look like giant armored eagles riding into battle. So yeah, absolutely.
You see this, for example, with football uniforms. The designs, those with black uniforms tend to be more aggressive, and maybe the uniform's bringing that out of them, but it also has an effect on the other people, where they're more likely to be intimidated by certain designs, or at least maybe it's meant to be more intimidating.
Oh, I like that.
I did not know.
Well, I was going to ask about Beskar steel as well, because obviously that's you know, it's used as currency and as a religious thing and for strength. Do we, or have we ever in history had anything like that?
I have no idea.
I have stumped the panel.
Well, you know, it's funny. We work with a lot of metals at the studio here. It feels like, you know, it's. I mean, in the show, I think it's a mind ore, but in reality, to get that kind of strength and lightweight and apparently ability to deflect lasers, it would have to be an alloy. In the real world, it would have to be some kind of special alloy, like titanium. You know, is a mixture of different metals to get the super lightweight quality and the strength in that metal. So it's interesting to think of a mineral that could possibly have all those things naturally.
Right. I mean, that's been one of the things people have been trying to find, is a super durable, lightweight metal that, you know, can do everything that you need it to do, but usually you're sacrificing weight for strength.
Yeah,
that's
that's always the trade-off for sure.
Well, I want to do one more little thing about Mandalorian, and that is something that may be a spoiler for the end of season 1. So you might want to jump ahead if you haven't seen the end of season 1 yet. But I want to ask about the Black Saber and what they may have done to create the effects and specialized weaponry and how that sort of stands out and intimidates.
I think we should start with the effects, Fon.
I agree.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with actually how they did that scene, but it does just appear to be a simple overlay of computer graphics on top of a black sword. The original dark saber showed up in the Clone Wars series. Actually, there's a whole history of it you could watch on YouTube of where
it's
the
really
black
cool.
came from. It's fascinating. There's a lot to it. For people who watched Clone Wars, I think it had a much more impact to the end of that series than people who weren't familiar. So, yeah, I'm not familiar with that particular part of the behind the scenes.
In terms of how it could work, I mean, less so in terms of the dark saber, the black saber, more so lightsabers. I mean, we have a theory that, it says essentially kind of plasma, which is constrained within a magnetic field. And interestingly enough, so plasma is material which is being superheated to kind of go to a different state. So you have solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. And if you were to kind of heat up certain noble gases like neon or like argon, they actually emit different colors. So if you Google kind of neon plasma or argon plasma, they're different colors, and there's purple, there's red, there's blue. So my theory on lightsabers is the kyber crystals are actually solids of a particular gas, which when charged emit the plasma constrained within some form of magnetic field. So that's my theory. I'm not clever enough to work it out, but we got people at Columbia University who are doing that. So.
I like that. Yeah, Steve sent me some very good lightsaber questions that I'm not even going to pretend to try to bring back from memory. So I'm reading this. But this is a really interesting question. I've been thinking about this since you sent it. And lightsabers cut through 99% of things in the Star Wars universe. The blades are essentially weightless. These make lightsabers incredibly dangerous to wield. But what sort of materials, gases, or other elements would it be prudent for a Jedi to be aware of given the properties of a lightsaber?
Yeah, that was one of the ones that was submitted through Facebook.
I like it.
Yeah, it's a good question because the heat of the lightsaber, that's something that comes up a lot. And obviously, if it is plasma, it's going to be heated and it's going to be really, really hot. But then you have them like igniting them right here. Like if they were that hot, as soon as Qui-Gon Jinn turned that on in that first episode, his head would have gone up in a ball of flame. So it's hard to, again, this is where the science and the science fiction just don't always line up. But one of the things that I've always kind of believed with lightsabers, and a friend of mine who actually was one of the fight choreographers on the prequels, is the idea that you're able to increase the heat through the use of the Force. And it's kind of, in my mind, what Qui-Gon is doing when you see him. It looks like he's picking the lock, but he's actually increasing the heat. So I would think there's some way that they can modulate the heat. Otherwise, you've just made it from a feasible close quarter weapon to, as soon as that thing goes on, friend or foe is going to get hit.
A singed ponytail right there.
But we have had non-Jedi pick them up and cut things with them.
Right. So it proves that you don't need to be able to use the Force to use the lightsaber. But I think that having the Force lets you utilize the lightsaber to a greater effect. So a regular person picking it up, it's only got a standard heat. But if you are a Jedi or a Force wielder, you're able to increase that heat as needed.
But also you do need to be able to wield the Force to actually create a lightsaber. So to actually build one, that's something that really only kind of Force sensitives are kind of able to do in terms of the construction. So maybe there's something that happens there.
Oh, that's really cool. Speaking of interesting tech, one of the things that I was thinking about this morning is the amount of anti-gravity stuff in the Star Wars universe. You've got speeders, you've got those desert speeders in the Mandalorian, you've got Baby Yoda's little egg thing. What can you talk about in terms of, I mean, I wish I could be more specific with this question. I'm just really curious about like why that from an effects standpoint, why that's become such a thing, or, you know, is that something we can do? I mean, I know there's like maglev stuff, but that's obviously not how this works.
From the Lucasfilm side, there was a rule for a long time that there were no wheels in Star Wars. That's something George Lucas would say often. There's no wheels in Star Wars. So all the way through, I think until Revenge of the Sith, when they wanted to pay tribute to Joe Johnston's art, they started going back and using some of his original concept art from the 70s, which had some wheels. But before that, the land speeder and all the anti-gravity vehicles and stuff came from this idea that there's no wheels in Star Wars. That was the rule for a long time.
That goes back to just the idea, I think, ever since the 50s, like the most futuristic thing you could have was a flying car. And there's nothing that screams kind of science fiction than stuff like hovering or flying effortlessly. But it is interesting that they ended up going from no wheels, and then they created BB-8, who was essentially just a wheel.
Yeah. Another interesting thing from the behind-the-scenes perspective, when they had the original land speeder, CG animation wasn't as prevalent. So the way they did that is they actually built a car and just put a mirror underneath it to block the wheels, and they drove that across the desert. And so it just reflected the ground in and around the vehicle and just created kind of a weird effect, and it looked like it was floating. It was a very simple trick, actually.
That's so cool. We're very easily tricked, and I like that.
Makes my job easier.
Practical effects.
I love practical effects. I wanted to also talk about, I know, Kieran, you were talking earlier before we started about Bacta tags and how close we are to that. You've got some interesting stuff going on at Columbia.
Yeah, first of all, not close at all. Well, kind of close, but Bacta is, for those who don't know, it's kind of the primary medical resource in the Star Wars galaxy. And it's just kind of like one-stop shop. It cures everything from, I like to think, like a hangover to kind of, you know, a lost limb. We see Luke Skywalker being plunged into a tank of it. So it's generally kind of like a big bath that kind of surrounds you. And whilst we don't have that kind of one-stop shop for healing everything, there is research being done where, so Bacta is actually, it's a bacteria-based substance. And essentially the bacteria can learn to heal basically anything that goes wrong. But research is being done to use bacteria to actually essentially replicate these matrices to create new tissue. So eventually you'll be able to use bacteria to kind of help create new grafts of skin, potentially to eventually maybe even grow new organs when they've been broken. So it's interesting that you know, so long ago they were using in Star Wars something that was bacteria based, and that's actually where we've gotten to now with kind of these healing gels.
So cool. Right now I have Epsom salts in a bath. That's it.
Just as good.
Same, absolutely the same. So I know you were also mentioning something about robotic hands, and you know, hands are a theme in Star Wars and the losing of them. So tell us a little bit about that. That's so cool.
Yeah, I mean, it probably comes back to Steve's point about lightsabers just being very dangerous. People losing hands left, right, and center. And it's interesting, given that they have Bacta, which is so good at kind of, we don't ever see it regrowing limbs. So, you know, maybe that's something where the limitations are. the fact that they both ended up having robotic hands, but robotic prosthetics is something that's really coming along at a rate of knots. And whilst we can create things where you can actually move the hands, one of the big things is actually sensing force, not the force, but just forces. So you could have a hand which is robotic and it might not know when to stop. So you picked up a glass and it would just crush it. So one of the things that's happening at Columbia is they are creating sensors which are actually allow the user to kind of, through this robotic hand, feeling that level of force. So you know how to grip tightly, not or less loose, and essentially just kind of not smashing everything with kind of like a big like Hulkbuster hand to skip over to another franchise. So we can feel forces with robotic hands, but not the force.
Same parent company, totally works.
Yeah, it's fine.
So yes, I know this is another Mandalorian question, but I know the documentary series is coming out soon, so I figured this is going to be on everyone's mind. But IG-11, I'd love to talk about a couple things with him, with the AI and the ability to reprogram something that was an assassin to a protective droid, but also it's very hard to, at least from some of the other stuff we've talked about on panels, it's hard to sort of emotionally connect with something, with a robot that doesn't look quite as human, though, we've got R2-D2, but an assassin droid, that's difficult. But by the end of the series, there are so many people online saying like, oh, I love him so much. And so let's talk about AI, AI that's willing to self-sacrifice. And is that even a possibility? Just talk about robots, droids. Oh God, just ignore that. Ignore what I said, droids.
I think it's actually very likely that AI would be willing to self-sacrifice because they don't have normally programmed in any kind of self-preservation. In fact, the idea of programming in self-preservation to a robot is a little terrifying because it may want to do things to harm others to self-preserve. So it's not something that's typically programmed into AI or robotics.
And it's who's doing the programming. It's going to be humanoids. Why would you want to give it that? Of course you want to give this hunk of junk a self, ability. Just I will do anything for you. It's not in our interest to create things at the moment which could potentially, think for themselves and have feelings.
Yeah, the risk would be high to give a robot. I've always actually, when we've talked about it, I've always thought that is exactly how you create the robot uprising. Is you give a robot the ability to worry about self-preservation. And then at some point with an AI, it's not unheard of, or it's not unlikely to think that they might just decide that you're a risk because we're a destructive culture. Like all of that sci-fi seems kind of tangible when you put it in that, frame it in that perspective.
But Asimov starts off with rules such as don't hurt the humans, or even RoboCop, don't hurt employees of the corporation that the programmer worked for. But sooner or later, somebody's going to forget to start with that rule.
Yeah, I'm never throwing out my toaster. I don't want it to be mad at me. I know that's another franchise too. So I wanted to talk a little bit, I know Rise of Skywalker makes everybody mad for whatever reason. I got death threats and people angry with me within minutes of the premiere. And someone spoiled the entire plot by the time I was already out of it, so I don't actually know how that worked.
Oh my God.
But there are a couple of psychological things in there, and one of them is that, again, there'll be spoilers, obviously, for this, but that before a major change of heart and almost complete personality change, though I'm sure there's a better way to say that, Kylo Ren, Ben, sees a vision of his father and everything switches. And he knows it's not really there. He knows it's not really his father, like, no Han Force Ghost, but but I'd love to hear about the psychology of that, of seeing visions of someone who cared about you, or having a thing from the past drastically change your focus.
Well, some of that's going to have to do with an issue we hit on earlier. What makes you conscious of yourself as an individual? And while somebody who's been a psychopath their entire lives, we're not going to see that. However, we have not seen Ben Solo his entire life. We've gotten enough hints that there was a good kid somewhere in there when he was growing up. For a long time, I had trouble understanding and even thinking how that empathetic kid in episode 1 could possibly have become that jerk Anakin and then that kind of cool bad guy Darth Vader. For a long time, my only explanation was because George. But the kid you see in episode 1, the changes he makes on the way to Anakin, and some of what we see going on, like in the family dynamics around Ben Solo, is it can be more easily explained if you compare it to drug addiction. In The Force Awakens, parents and Ben, Kylo, are acting like a family in the family dynamics of parents dealing with an adult child that they've lost to drug addiction. There are signs that there has been someone they've been attached to and the person has changed. Addiction can shut down the better qualities of a person, shut down parts of an individual. We can do that with other individuals. Brain injury can shut off the empathetic part of yourself. A magnetic field, transcranial magnetic stimulation on just the right part of your brain can make you not notice the immoral aspects of a particular situation. So there are things that can change, and something to help you reconnect with your own values, remind you of those parts of yourself might help bring out the better part. You know, the addicts who do have this moment of clarity, it's like, what have I become? Where am I? And they hit rock bottom. And sometimes it takes something like a visit to granddad or a picture of mom to make them think about where they've reached.
That's really cool. Yeah, it actually, I mean, I know we've brought this up on panels before, but and a lot of Star Wars is about redemption. But I think this is something, if people haven't seen our panels before, I'd love to hear about the psychology of evil, and can pure evil exist?
Oh gosh, I talk about this.
See, I do it to you every time.
Well, also I talk about it in most of my books. These issues of psychology of evil, the psychology of evil.
I like eagles.
Evil eagles.
Psychologists will disagree with each other on the issue itself. Are there evil people? Plenty will say, no, there are only evil actions. Some of us take the view that, yeah, there are evil people. Not all psychopaths are actively doing the worst things, but some have more extreme qualities. You know, the main quality for what's originally defined as psychopathy is this lack of empathy, this lack of caring about the feelings of others. But that doesn't necessarily bring out the worst in you. So the person who is like that, and they're manipulative, and they're egotistical, and they delight in cruelty, that is getting into what we call the dark tetrad, not to be confused with the McDonald triad. Some people think I'm talking about that when I refer to the dark triad or tetrad. That's a dangerous, terrible combination. Somebody who's super egotistical, lacks empathy, they delight in cruelty, and they don't have this conscience to hold themselves back. By psychopath, we're talking about somebody who's grown up that way. They've never known what it was. They were the kid who was harming animals when they were 5, and they've never had this connection to other people. And those are things that we look at in terms of people. In terms of actions, it's easy to define actions that we consider to be evil. And Palpatine fits every single quality of that whole dark tetrad. He's incredibly manipulative, egotistical. He's got your psychopath's semblance of empathy, in that he knows a lot of what other people are feeling, but he's not feeling it himself. He's using it to manipulate them, you know, for his own purposes.
I like that. Okay, so this is a complete departure, but Palpatine there's, you know, discussions about whether or not he's a clone, and obviously cloning has been a huge thing all through the Star Wars series. Where are we in terms of cloning right now?
I think we can do it with sheep. So beyond that, I mean, yeah, it's definitely possible. And in terms of like the human genome, we're getting to a point where, you know, there's such a thing as designer babies, which, and you know, it's all possible, but there's understandably a huge concern around the ethics of it. Just because you can do it, should you do it? You know, even around designer babies, where you can say, I want a kid with this color eyes and this color hair, and I want it to be a boy or a girl. Are these decisions that we really should be making? And this technology, things like CRISPR, which are kind of gene editing, was really created not for that, but to kind of hopefully eradicate some of these genetic diseases. So it is interesting to me that if Palpatine was a clone, why'd he still mess up his face like that?
Yeah, yeah, I wondered that too. And
that menacing look you were talking about earlier.
Yes.
Yeah, he's definitely creepy.
Oh, he had a split in his head, which actually did make me think that he was the Emperor from the first time I saw him, which is weird. That it turns out that he was a clone of the Emperor. And I'd always imagined that that was because he was thrown off of that gantry, which doesn't make sense that it would come back in a clone, but maybe he was physically damaged enough to where they couldn't get enough DNA or the right kind of DNA. Maybe they don't use DNA to clone in Star Wars. I don't know. But like his clones seemed like they were flawed.
And it could be that he wanted to match that that image of how he used to look, because he wanted people to think that he was indestructible. He didn't want people to think that he was just a clone. He was the original, and you cannot beat him. That's probably why he had a whole stadium of weird ghosty football fans.
Or they used a vat of the bacteria to grow mostly, forget growing a new head, he grew a mostly new body.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, you know, one of the things that you see explored in sci-fi a lot is cloning and how one would actually react. And is there any study in terms of like how you would react to that? Because talking about say you're cloning a pet. Do you react to that pet the same way? Do they develop things differently because of environment versus genetics?
Well, there are people who act like it's the same pet when they've gotten one who just this one looks like that old pet so much that they even give them the same name, and you hear them at times talking like they've got the same person. Not the same person. Well, depending on what your pet is, and but it is a different individual. It is not the same one that it was before. No more than your identical twin is the same person. For all the similarities, it is still a different organism with a different brain and maybe very similar life experiences, but people act often as if they're dealing with the same one as before. And that right there is going to shape behavior, either model you into being like the one before or giving you something to rebel against.
So I also wanted to talk about something that I've always thought about Star Wars. I love swords. If I turn my camera around, you'll see a lot of them in the house. I love that. I am not a fan of guns, but when guns came in, they changed history. So I'd love to hear about the blasters versus lightsabers. Is it really, or could it be as effective a lightsaber as a blaster if it were real, which it is in my mind?
I think in the hands of a Jedi, the lightsabers are effective at blocking blasters, so that would make them a superior weapon. But I don't think that a normal person wielding a lightsaber would have the same success. The lightsaber, I think, would rely 100% on who's wielding it, whether it's better or not than a blaster. But it certainly seems superior if you can block a blaster with it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree agree. Again, going back to, we've seen that you don't have to be a Jedi to pick up and use a lightsaber, but you're not going to be able to use that weapon to anywhere near what it's designed for. It's like Fon was saying, in the hands of a regular person, you've got a blaster, I've got a lightsaber, that's not going to go so well. But against a Jedi, they train to deflect the blaster bolts, sometimes back at the opponent. So, yeah, I'd have to give it to the blasters, as much as I love swords and edged weaponry, just for your everyday person. Unless you're a Jedi, don't pick up the lightsaber.
But I really want to.
You can.
Okay. I can be a Jedi. You don't know. But
That's
one.
right.
So before we wrap everything up, I know one of the things that we don't really talk about that much is in the panel by itself is the Force and the idea of the Force and how close we can come with meditation and things like that. I know there have been a lot of studies about what happens to the brain during meditation, or are there any psychological techniques that would come close to something like the Force?
Going into a meditative state alters what's going on with the brain. It can make the alpha waves more dominant, the other brain waves less active, really reaching a particularly calm state. In terms of whether or not that will broadcast something to all other living beings, that falls a little outside of what's available for testable science. So psychology, biology, they don't have anything that will definitely confirm the possibility of anything. But by that logic, you'd have trouble ruling it out. But then again, you can't prove there are no leprechauns in my backyard.
I bet there are.
We know there are beings, ants communicate with each other. We know how. And so just because we don't know how some other beings might be able to communicate with, 200 years ago, nobody knew for sure how those ants were communicating with each other. They were guessing it had to do with those antennae, but they didn't know. And there's actually more to it than that.
I have a theory.
You have a theory?
Ants have a higher count of metachlorines.
Yeah.
100%.
Then why are they always carrying everything? Why don't they just float it back to their colony?
No, they're too small to have enough metachlorines.
You guys, ant midichlorian is like the best hashtag that we could possibly come up with for this panel. All right. Well, before we go, let's go around in the same order that we introduced, and because I think everyone's pictures have switched in this. So, and say where we can find you guys online.
I think that would be start with you, Jenna.
Oh, with me? Oh, I usually wrap it up. So we'll start with you guys.
That would be Travis.
I am at Superheroologist on Twitter. Facebook and Twitter are the easiest ways to find me. Just look for Travis Langley. I am almost certainly the one you will locate. My books are all over the place.
Yes, they are.
I am Fon H. Davis. That's spelled F-O-N. H. Davis on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. If you want to follow my studio, it's at Fonco Studios on all the social media as well. And then if you want to catch some of my work, it just went on to Amazon Prime streaming. You could watch some of my educational material there.
Nice. I am Kieran Dickson. If you search me on social media, like Travis, I am almost certainly the one that you will find.
And I'm Steve Huff. You can find me at creativecombatla.com or on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Creative Combat.
Okay, you can find me at Jenna Busch, B-U-S-C-H, like the beer, not the president. And I know I say that at every panel, but I just got another tweet for the other Jenna Busch today. So yeah, there's a C in my name. So it's at Jenna Busch on Twitter, Instagram, and Jenna Busch 13 on Facebook, or Jenna Busch public page. I will answer you on both. So thank you guys so much for coming to our virtual panel, and may the Force be with you.
May the Force be with you.